let's have a discussion about channel overrides. This can go for voice channels, this can go for text channels, and it can go for categories and their synced channels. If you don't know how that works, that's fine. We will be going over that today. But first, what exactly is an override? You might have heard the term before, but let's go over it just for those of you that might not have. Let's go into our server settings, then into our role settings. Then you can see probably a few roles, if you've ever set any up. I have some color roles, some staff and bot roles, and then a muted role and a mute override role. This will be used in examples later. So if you look at all these little settings, these little ticks on the side, you can see that they can either be on or they can be off. Simple enough, right? So this at everyone at the bottom here, everyone gets this. It's not a role, but it's the basic permissions that everyone gets. These roles on top of here can be used to add permissions to this. But regardless of what is not ticked in these other ones, if it's ticked here, everyone gets it. Remember, if this one has it, then everyone gets it unless it is overridden. So let's say I don't want anyone to be able to mention everyone. So I untick it here. But even if it's unticked here, and I give them the red role, which can, then they'll still be able to, just because they have the red, which has this permission, even though this one doesn't. If they have any role that is green for a given permission, they can use it unless it is overridden. Keep that in mind as you're setting up your servers, because if you have a permission like this, like mention everyone or manage messages, then they'll be able to use it throughout the server unless it is overridden. So moving on from that, you can think of these base permissions that they get from the roles in the server settings as a base. You can think of this as the first layer to your permissions, and overrides are what let you be very individual, specific, and customize your server a lot. They can be very helpful, but a lot of users don't use them just quite right. A very good rule to keep in your mind while doing overrides is keep it as simple as possible. If a role already doesn't have that permission, there's no need to have it as an X, as a red tick in the channel overrides. It just inherits everything it says here unless stated otherwise. Try to avoid making as many overrides as possible. Avoid it. Because the more overrides you make, the more complicated stuff is whenever you want to edit something. If something doesn't need permission, don't give it to it. Rule of thumb, keep this in mind. Trying to stress this out here because a lot of users make that mistake. And I did too in the beginning, don't get me wrong. So now that we have this kind of basis set up, you're probably wondering, where exactly can overrides be applied? You keep talking about them, but how do you use them? So let's go over to our rules channel. I already set up some kind of just basic random rules, but I don't want just anyone to be able to talk here, like this random user over here, who is my alternate account that I'll also be using to test this today. I can talk here, since I'm the owner, and I am always an admin because I'm the owner. I can talk here however I see fit, but if my alt wants to chat here, then it can too. Let me switch over to my alt real quick. As you can see, now my alt can talk here. But I don't want my alt to talk here. So that's where overrides come into play. So let's go into the rules channel settings. You can see this little cog right here. It says edit channel. Go ahead and click that. And go over to permissions. This is your overrides menu. And you see all these gray little slashes right here. This is what you can call a gray tick. So these gray ticks, what they're saying is default. What the gray tick means is default. This inherits directly whatever server permissions you have set up in your server settings. Remember how I said the server settings were the server role settings? They are a base. Now these are the things that can edit from that base. If you want your users to be able to talk in most channels, then in the server role settings, you say that they can send messages. But if you don't want them to send only in the rules channel, then you go ahead and you say this. This means I am overriding the base settings so that they do not have this permission. But this goes for everyone, unless they're the owner or they have admin in the server settings. So how do we allow someone with the owner role to edit the rules? Let's say we have multiple owners and the other owner doesn't have the permissions to go and edit the rules, and we want to give him them. So we go ahead and say that this is a green tick. So this says I am completely taking away any block from sending messages that may be in the rest of this override list. Even if the server settings say I cannot send messages, or even if any other override like this one says that I cannot send messages, anyone with the owner role can now send messages in this channel. Regardless of any other permissions, as long as they can see this channel, they can now send messages. This will always overwrite a red tick. The green tick will always overwrite a red tick. This comes up as an issue a lot when people want to add a muted role. When you want to add a muted role and you say that people should not be able to send messages, and then you have another role that has a green tick, the green tick, regardless of where it is in the list, will always overwrite the red tick. So what I mean about keeping permissions minimal is you don't want to go ahead and just green tick everything. You don't want to do this, and you don't want to do this. Try to keep everything you can in this gray, because the more permissions that you keep here, the easier everything will be able to edit if you ever want to, and the less issues you're going to come up with. If you can, keep it in the gray. If you're ever confused, feel free to message me and I'll try and help you out with permissions, because I've been doing this for a long time. And the last thing I want to see is someone set up their entire server and only realize they completely messed up the permissions. So, okay, now we've done that. Hope it didn't go by too fast, but now owners can send messages. Everyone else cannot. Let's just make sure that's right. I can still send messages, but if we switch over to my alternate account, I cannot send messages anymore, so it worked as planned. If we go ahead and give my alternate account the owner role, and then we switch back over to it, then my alt is now able to send messages. Perfect! That's exactly what we were going for. Well, my alt isn't an owner, so it doesn't need it. But I was talking about muted roles a minute ago. Another issue that people have is with them, like I said. So let's talk about those. No talking is going to be my muted role for this little tutorial. And so we're going to be using CarlBot for our bot to create this role, and should work pretty well. So even though the muted role has these permissions, each time you create a new role, by the way, it inherits whatever permissions this bottom one has. So if you want, you can remove the permissions for this and just give everyone a base kind of role. But I'm sure you'll get the hang of it the more you practice permissions, so try not to get too fancy with them right now. This is our muted role. So we're just going to go over here to General, make sure we have the right command, which in this case is mute role. So we're going to do mute role no talking. And now CarlBot has set no talking to the mute role. So we're going to go ahead and do mute role update. And so what this command does is it already automatically adds the overrides to each channel for the mute role. And so the mute role, as you can see, very, very simple right here. All it does is put a red tick for send messages and a red tick for add reactions. That's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. No green ticks, no extra red ticks. That's all. But let's have it now so that I want can always talk. To always be able to talk. As you can see here, can always talk is below no talking, but since it's a green tick, it doesn't matter. This can always talk, green tick, overrides the red tick. Green tick always overrides red tick. Gray tick is the server settings, is the base. That's all there is to overwrites. Everything else is up to your imagination and up to whatever creativity you can come from it. Gray tick is default, is server settings. Red tick is override cannot. Green tick always overrides red tick and means it can, regardless of where they are in this list. I'm really trying to stress that here, because that's, if you get anything out of this tutorial, that's what I want you to get. So now I'm going to go ahead and mute my alt. My alt can now not talk in general. If I go over here, cannot talk. But if I go back to my main and add the can always talk, and I go back to my alt, oh, should be able to talk now if I set that up right, which I guess I did not. 1 second. Gotta check here to make sure this actually. Oh, yeah, you see, I didn't actually set it up because I didn't save. Can send. There we go. Now we go back to my alt, and now it can talk. As you can see. So that is about it that there is to overrides, and that's completely fine. You can use categories to quickly set up overrides. Like if I want to make all of the text channels have the same overrides, I can click Edit Category, Permissions, and then set overrides here, and then go back to General or whatever other channels, go to Edit Channels, and then click Sync. And then that allows you to group edit permissions at once. It's kind of an advanced move, and if you're not doing anything complicated, then it shouldn't really matter. So if you know what you're doing, go ahead and test around with it. Try using a testing server first. Something else that people really love to use overrides for is verification channels. So before we end this off here, I'm going to talk about that. If you go into server settings and you go to roles, and then you deny everyone the read text channels and voice channels, if you deny this, then you can avoid that ugly little lock icon that you can get here. The lock icon comes from this right here, from denying everyone to read messages by override. But if you have it as the default settings, it doesn't put the lock. So if you deny it in server settings, green tick inherits the unable to read server messages, and then you can have, like, let's say the red role is the role that everyone gets after they join the server. So if they can read everything like this, then they can read everything normally. Then you just use an override to allow people to read the whatever channel you have the verification message in. So that's a lot of information, and I completely understand if you're confused after that. I probably went a bit fast too. Feel free to message me whenever. You can find me in the Carlbot support Discord, and I will help you clarify whatever questions you may have about overrides. Just try your best to understand first, and if you can't figure it out by Google or anything, go ahead and ask me some questions. So I hope that helped you at least a little bit on the complicated topic of overrides. I'm not the best at explaining it myself, and like I said, if you have any questions, message me.